Welcome again to the Cast Distillery podcast, where we unlock the full potential of ServiceNow with expert insights and practical strategies only here on the Cast Distillery podcast. And with me today, I've got a special guest, Chris Skaggs, who comes to us as a customer and actually a former coworker. He's now at ServiceNow. He's a ServiceNow Global Product Owner at the AES Corporation. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for taking time out of your so busy schedule to talk to me and everybody watching this today.
Yeah. Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me today.
Oh, no problem. I wanted you to also, if you could, give a little bit more of an intro than I did, a little bit more about your background before we get into some of the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, I'm the global product owner at the AES Corporation. I started working in the ServiceNow space as of September, so this month, 10 years ago, actually. I was working with my role kind of in the ServiceNow ecosystem at APS, another electric utility company here locally in Arizona. And I was working in field services and wearing a lot of different hats. I was also a BlackBerry administrator at the time on the BES server. So doing a lot of work, and we at APS, we had implemented ServiceNow Discovery, and I was brought in just to sort of help with that. Had really no background or understanding of ServiceNow other than incident management, kind of a ticketing tool. And we did the implementation with Fruition Partners, a consultancy that now, DXC, I think, owns Fruition, but I was with Fruition, helping them out. And as we wrapped up that Discovery implementation, they said, hey, if you're ever interested and you want to start working in the ServiceNow space, just apply for a position here at Fruition and we'll put in a good word for you. And so I did that. And 10 years ago, Fruition Partners hired me on as a technical consultant. And I did that for a while and moved in-house after doing an implementation over a couple years with Symantec. And I was one of their ServiceNow administrators for a few years. Jumped back into consulting again, working with Vertiva, then Ikorio, and also with you all, with Skaggs as well. Primarily doing mostly solutioning, kind of solution consultant, those types of roles, kind of in pre-sales. And then, I am where I am today, 10 years later at the AES Corporation as their global product owner.
So you've really been on both industry and consulting, which is really a good broad set of experience. And now at AES, you're basically, you're the platform owner, product manager, if you will. But at AES, coming in as a platform owner, how do you recommend identifying, what and where the important things are to address when you come into a situation like that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to really initially, I think, gauging the health of the platform and understanding where they're at today. If you've administrated on the platform long enough, right, one of the first things you tend to do is look at upgrade history. Like, let's see what's happened recently when they've upgraded this platform. I've never seen this platform before. So what's been going on? And right away, you can look at, how many skipped items somebody has after an upgrade. And when you start seeing that number creep over, a few hundred, 500 plus, in our case, we were looking at probably around 1,500 skipped items just on the most recent upgrade. That lets you know that there's probably a lot of customization, right? A lot of technical debt going on within the platform. And then after that, it's really just trying to get an understanding kind of historically how the organization's been using ServiceNow. Really building relationships right away early on and knowing like who are all the stakeholders, both from an executive level and then really, who owns the different areas of the platform historically, like who's been doing on the SMO side, for example, incident, problem, change. If you're using other apps and modules, right, who historically has kind of been the person that's the focal point of contact when it comes to the things that have been done in that area of the ServiceNow platform. And so once you start sort of mapping those people out, like who's who, having conversations and just sitting down with them. What are your thoughts on ServiceNow? Has it been something that's been good for AES? Has it been something that's been a challenge? What have you enjoyed about it, right? And then just really kind of understanding the nuts and bolts of who's who, and what's been going on historically within the platform itself. That lets you start mapping out like the challenges, the areas that they're probably strong in and they succeed in, and then really like what has the governance looked like based on those people you've had those conversations with. Is it mature? Is it lacking? And you can start really, I think, getting a lay of the land and understanding what ServiceNow looks like.
Great. And you mentioned, skipping updates. And what I wanted to ask you about next is dealing with all the inherited, really technical debt. And I was hoping you could talk to those watching and listening about some of the impacts of that technical debt that you basically inherited.
Yeah, well, you know, the one thing is our organization, right? We're a large global electric utility. And as far as ServiceNow is concerned, we've historically been, and still even today, kind of handled through managed services. And that's because the internal team itself here at AES, we just haven't had, I think, enough people that know ServiceNow well enough to say like, hey, I'm somebody who can administrate the platform or develop on the platform. And, beyond that, just the fact that we've run pretty lean lets you start to realize that due to the amount of skipped updates that we have, right, people probably aren't really managing. That's kind of where I think I started to identify right away that governance was probably lacking a little bit. The fact that there was so many skipped items, and those skipped items themselves, right, there were not anything being done to address them. It was kind of just like skipped and no action taken. And what that meant for us was, and what it means for ServiceNow's end, is that we weren't seeing the fruits of all of the major releases. You could go into the release notes and say, hey, they're doing this great thing with major incident, or they're doing this other thing within SecOps. And we weren't seeing the benefits of a lot of those changes that were coming because ServiceNow skips those things if you've made customizations to them. So, the fact that we had so many, it was an instance that we had in place for 6 years, prior to me coming on board. And the fact that we were global, we started out in Brazil. Brazil initially kind of managed our ServiceNow instance. Then it got handed off to one managed service partner, then another managed service partner, and then another. And over time, it expanded into, Argentina and other areas of Latin America, El Salvador, the United States, right? We were all using the platform. And we were essentially, as we grew, sort of expanding, from the ground level, what Brazil had put in place. Beyond the skipped items, what it meant too was, right away, I'd go into tickets when I first came here, and short description and a lot of things on incidents, or, on some of the stuff within Agile, enhancements and stories, they were in Spanish, they were in Portuguese. And so, it was probably a matter of either people that were working on those tickets as fulfillers. They probably looked at those and said like, oh, I'm not going to take that on. And it just sat because it wasn't in their native language. Or they were going in and opening it up and kind of copying and pasting things into Google Translate and kind of getting the best guess on what people were trying to say. And then working those tickets and updating them in their own native language. And it just became a big disconnect, right, between the fulfillers and between the people that were submitting tickets. And so all those things added up to a platform, right, that was in a bit of disarray. There wasn't really any gatekeeping going on. There were things, like I said, in multiple languages without dynamic translation in place. And, it was just something that we needed to kind of get our arms around and figure out, how did we want to proceed forward at that point with where we were at with the state of the platform.
Wow, that's a lot. I mean, walking into that. So when you start thinking about vision, so you walk in, you got to deal with what's there. You look at the technical debt. How did you go about defining and sharing your vision at that point?
I was kind of lucky in some ways. My director at the time that hired me on, she was essentially sharing some of the challenges they were facing on the platform. And, all of it stemmed from that lack of governance and really just managed services saying yes, because we were paying a bill saying, hey, do this. And anytime anybody within the organization, no matter where they were located globally, if they came to the managed service partner and said, hey, we want this done within ServiceNow, it was just kind of a, yeah, we'll go ahead and do it for you, right? And she was of the mentality, the director that hired me, of like, let's blow this thing up. Like, I want to start it all over again. And really, right away when I started talking to her about that, we were discussing, how do we strategically do that the best way and the right way? And that decision came down to the vision, to your point, was, let's go ahead and re-platform ServiceNow. And that term, right, for those that aren't familiar with replatforming, really is, let's go ahead and stand up a brand new instance of ServiceNow, and let's try and do things from a best practice, sort of out of the box perspective. We don't really call it customizations, or we don't approach things from a customization perspective any longer. It's really more of a configuration, right? You go into things that are already there. And if you're not going through and changing sort of some of the core things, the business rules that are out of the box, the script includes all the technical stuff that people probably are going to fall asleep trying to listen to on this podcast. But those things that are technical components, right? Saying, let's not really touch those things, but let's figure out how we can properly configure the system so that it meets the needs, but also allows us to continue to have those major instance upgrades and those new capabilities, brought forth. So we're able to leverage those things. One big piece of that too, that I'll hit on is ServiceNow. They started out really as an IT service management solution, incident problem change, ticketing solution in that regards with service catalog. And over the years, right, they've expanded, right? HR, they went into SecOps, they're going into OT, operational technologies, even, legal service delivery. There's so many things that it's doing nowadays beyond just IT service management. When organizations like AES and others started using it, at the time, it didn't have capabilities they needed. So they were using App Engine and a lot of other things to custom build solutions and ticketing tools for those capabilities that weren't there. And so, over the 6 years, we were saying, hey, we need to use some HR capabilities. And we built our own sort of custom HR case solution and other things too on the platform. And those were a big piece, I think, of some of that technical debt we talk about. But ServiceNow brought those things into the platform over time. And so we were at an intersection where, hey, we've got this custom app that does these things. ServiceNow has released this thing, and they continue each release to improve upon it and give more capabilities. And our stakeholders, within HR and within other areas of AES are saying, we would love to be able to do that as well. Well, we can't just bolt those things onto our custom application. It just builds more and more technical debt. And so, you start to say, I want to use those out of the box capabilities. And of course, there's licensing costs that come with that, right? And ServiceNow is not an inexpensive tool to use. So you start saying, hey, we want to leverage those capabilities. How do we do that best? And I think replatforming for us checked the boxes of saying, hey, we're not going to be carrying a lot of those custom built applications and capabilities. We're going to start fresh. And to the vision point, right? We're going to give AES what they need when it comes to, we want to be able to do some legal service delivery stuff, or we want to do some OT stuff or HR stuff. And we can use those out of the box capabilities and get the improvements that ServiceNow is giving us on top of that. And so we really built that from there, right? The vision of, these are the things that we want to do as far as our roadmap's concerned. But let's kind of crawl, walk, run. Let's get ourselves to the point of where we need to be with the best practice out of the box solution and kind of go from there. And so, we'll talk more about it. There's definitely some other challenges that have come with how we've replatformed, and how we approach that, because we had to keep things afloat for everybody else. So we couldn't just stand this thing up and then everything else everybody was using just be turned off immediately. And so we're wrapping up replatforming now. We've had to do things kind of in parallel with 2 production environments. So we'll jump into that eventually, but I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but I think that's really where we started.
You went really wide with that, which was great, because you actually addressed like 3 of my questions in there. So you talked about the vision, and you did hit on, how the decision came to replatform. And fortunately, you being a former solutions consultant, you talked about naturally what replatforming is. But then you also talked about your hopes, like why you were replatforming. But I do want to hit on, and you mentioned this, is what were the concerns or issues about replatforming that you were concerned about, that you were like keeping you up at night? What were those? What did that look like?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to, I'll start first with those custom apps. We've had capabilities, right, that we've leveraged, and we implemented some of those things, within the last 2 years. And so there was a cost up front, right? And we're still kind of working on our ROI on those implementations of those custom solutions. Um, and with that, a big piece of anything you do on ServiceNow, or I think within any tool within an organization, is OCM. And the organization spent a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources on putting OCM in place around some of the things that we have. That HR case solution being one in particular. And so one of the things that I learned through the process, and I think with my background being in sort of a solution architect capacity and doing consulting, you tend to carry, and I think it's very valuable, that sort of sales skill with you, because you have to be able to sell the organization on your vision. And I was very kind of gung ho at the time on saying, let's move to the HRSD solution within ServiceNow. And I don't want to say I was being deaf to or not listening to HR within AES's needs, but I think I was sort of saying like, yeah, I understand you guys spent a lot of money on this solution before, and it does what you need it to do today, but think about what HRSD could do for you in the future, right? And all these other things. And the reality was, right, HR case, the way we had built it was perfect for our needs. That's really all we were using it for. Workday was accommodating everything else. And a simple HR case ticketing tool was what HR needed. The licensing costs were very high. But the biggest piece of it that I was just talking about was that OCM effort, the training that we had to do to get this in place. And the fact that we were going to be replatforming meant that there was going to be a lot of change fatigue. We've been doing this now for about a year with the replatforming, and most of it has been around, the ITSM side of things, as well as putting in ITOM that we never had before, ServiceNow Discovery to give us a CMDB that we never had, which is huge. It complements ITSM. It's really the backbone of what you do within ServiceNow. And so getting that foundation in place, and everything that we're doing now, moving to Employee Center off of Service Portal, using virtual agent, dynamic translation, integrating with teams. We're doing a lot of things, but with that, again, comes that sort of change fatigue. We have a lot of things that we're doing from an OCM perspective there. And then on top of that, if you want to start saying, well, we're also going to do HRSD, as exciting as it is, right? I had to start listening to the HR folks that have been here for a while on the technology side. And I think that was one of the challenges, to your point, that I ran into is, we've been doing things for a while here and really listening to why we did the things that we did and understanding how much work, effort, and time went into those things, and saying maybe it makes more sense if we table that, right? Let's move that HR case solution in so we can meet the needs of HR. And then let's kind of use this new replatformed instance for a good year or so. And by doing that, if we succeed with replatforming, right, we're going to win over AES and the rest of the organization. We're going to excite people and say like, wow, look what they've done with replatforming. Look at the gains, the benefits that we're getting within ServiceNow. Maybe it makes sense now. It's been a year. Let's go ahead and look at that HRSD solution and let's see what it can give us. And you start buying a little bit of favor from the rest of AES or the rest of the organization you work for by doing this initial phase of replatforming the right way and succeeding. And so I had to go back and say, hey, we're not going to get HRSD today. Maybe it's something we use in the future, but I want to be mindful of the fact that we did spend a lot of money, a lot of time. We put a lot of OCM in place to get some of these custom apps in place. And you had to pick and choose, with HR kind of case being one of the things that we're going to move over into the replatformed instance, but maybe down the road, we'll approach it from an HRSD perspective and be mindful, of the things that we've done before I got here. And I think that mindfulness is a big piece of it, right? Being a global organization, we have people all over the world, a lot of people in Latin America, and economies differ, right? All over the world. You're talking about, some crazy inflation, upwards 40-50% in Argentina. And for us, for example, to say like, oh, well, In the US, it's mice or something like a throwaway, right? We just count that as an accessory. We don't even track it within ServiceNow. Well, you talk to people in Latin America, and there is a cost associated with those small kind of components and accessories. And you have to be mindful of those sorts of things, those economies that are global, and understand that those impact the decisions that are made. And it's not just something within the lens of what we see here in the United States. It's something that we have to look at from a global perspective when we approach any solution that we want to do within ServiceNow.
I want to talk a little bit, because coming into the organization new, sharing your vision, dealing with the challenges, dealing with the technical debt, now deciding to re-platform. Let's talk a little bit about team. Like, I'm assuming you had to build a team, and it's kind of a two-part. How did you, bring in the team? What were the considerations? But then also from, what are you going to do in-house versus with a partner? Because you've had a managed services partner there. What did that look like for you coming into that?
Yeah, it was, I really had to look at what was, to my point earlier, the CMDB and ITOM being really just a core foundational element of ServiceNow. I always call it sort of the backbone of the platform. Having a CMDB, right, it helps you tremendously. You're able to get more insight and vision. You're able to be more proactive instead of reactive. And by that, I mean, when I'm opening an incident or I'm opening a change, if I don't have a CMDB and I understand the relationship of all the infrastructure that we have, I have no idea what the upstream and downstream impacts of the things I'm doing are. We can implement a change and it may bring down a bunch of other things, right? Which are going to create a bunch of major incidents and cause a lot of problems. And so with a managed service partner, right, we can leverage things like an administrator. I hate to say this, but administrators a lot of times come and go. You start promoting, I know like where I've been before, you bring somebody in and they start out sort of as a junior administrator on the platform. They learn the ropes, and after a year, they're already looking for, other places that are going to pay them well to be more of an experienced ServiceNow administrator. And so you go through that cycle pretty regularly, sometimes of those junior types of roles. And looking at that, right, having administrators or even developers handle the managed services perspective, but knowing how key the ITOM and the CMDB component is, and knowing that that's kind of a lifelong journey on the platform as you continue to grow, I needed to find somebody, as you talk about the team, somebody that worked for us at AES, that was kind of that full-time role and that responsibility, that was the ITOM CMDB architect, that had experience doing that specifically within ServiceNow. And so I'd start working internally on saying, hey, this is a very important resource for us, and ensuring that we had, the necessary budget to bring that person in. And I think that was the first role that I brought into the organization. And we had somebody here that's been here for a while as well, that I've kind of moved into that lead ServiceNow administrative role. But the rest of it, from the rest of the administration and the rest of the development, is really done through managed services with our oversight, right? We have kind of a Scrum Master type thing that takes place where we go through bi-weekly sprints and we look at the backlog. We call it the Enhancement Advisory Board. But within that, right, we have people from the SMO here at AES on the incident side, the problem, the change, service catalog, HR, the other areas as well. And we look at the intake of those stories and enhancements that are coming into the platform. And we basically gatekeep and say, does it make sense for us to proceed with this? Is it going to create technical debt, going forward? And we work closely with the managed services side, right? They're also a part of those conversations to say, these are the things that we think you should be taking on this month. These are the things that we're going to say no to. And then strategizing with them to say, we think it's going to take about this many points or this many hours of development, and making sure we're aligned, right? So that we're keeping things within the guardrails of what our managed services allow on a month-to-month basis.
So we've got team now involved, your view on team and partnership. I wanted to ask you about governance as well, because I would imagine you coming in hot to an extent. How are you dealing with, now that you've got the re-platform, you've got your vision, people are buying into it. How are you dealing with the intake and demand and governance of that?
So a lot of that, again, was, from the governance perspective, identifying, who are the people that represent the different modules, applications, capabilities of the ServiceNow platform. And by that, I mean, who are the people that have a say on whether or not we do the things that we do in those areas. And so we started to establish that, right? Starting to build basically a Visio of a diagram saying, these are the people that represent those different areas. So we knew who to go to. And then implementing that within ServiceNow, right? Using Flow Designer to say, when a story comes in or an enhancement, right? We redesign. So that, by the way, that comes in via service catalog item today. And on that catalog item, before you start to move through the catalog item, you're selecting essentially, what is it from an enhancement or story perspective within ServiceNow that this is going to impact? Is this on the incident side? Is this on the catalog side? All the things that we talk about, the different applications and modules. And then from there, building a flow on the back end that essentially says, if this story or enhancement comes in and it happens to impact incident management, it needs to go through from the governance perspective, who represents within AES incident management. So they get an approval that comes in, right? And that approval gives them details on the enhancement or story with a link to it. So they can go view that as well and dive in a little bit deeper. But they're the first level of sort of gatekeeping that and saying, yay or nay, we're going to proceed forward with that enhancement or story. And then when they approve it, right, it then comes to me. And it comes to as well our administrator and our architect of the platform, the ITOM CMDB individual I mentioned before. And the three of us, any one of the three of us essentially then look at it at that point, and then we go through and approve it to proceed forward. So once it goes through sort of those two portions of approval, then it moves into the backlog, right? And that's where we meet with our managed service on a biweekly basis and say, these are the ones that have gone through for approval, and these are the things that we're going to proceed forward with. And then we have X number of hours with the managed service, right, partner, to develop those things. And we ensure, right, that we're meeting the capacity of what we have on a month-to-month basis. So we're not exceeding that. And we're not going vastly below that as well, right? We want to get the most bang for our buck. We get a use it or lose it scenario essentially with those hours. And so we want to make sure we're coming in as close as possible to the amount of hours that we have on a month-to-month basis. And we're also funneling those things through, like I said, that flow that we redesigned, that catalog item that we redesigned to make sure that we have the right eyes on those things and it's either going to go forward or it's not. And before we had none of that, right? It basically just went through, the managed services picked it up and they just said, yep, we'll go ahead and proceed with it without anybody saying yay or nay.
So going back to the business side of this, as we kind of start to wrap this up, is how are you reflecting the business value back up to leadership or the organization right now? Do you have anything practical you can share with that? Is there a meeting or something that you do to share all that with and say, hey, this is where we're going, this is what we got?
Yeah. So initially we had, we'd identified all the executive stakeholders, the different people globally that represented, different areas of AES, not just within ServiceNow, but just within AES on the whole. And we had to go through the entire process of putting together, it was probably like a 30-slide presentation that I had to build of, why replatforming is what we wanted to do, with the vision of why we wanted to do that. And then going forward, right, we have a monthly executive steering committee call. And I'm meeting with those same steering committee folks every month to let them know from a replatforming perspective, where we're at, the status of the replatforming, where we've had any challenges and how we've addressed those challenges, and where we've had wins, even where we've had losses, things that have been tough that maybe we've that's caused a change order, it's caused something that's slipped a little bit. But we always stay in lockstep with the executives and the steering committee in those monthly calls. I also keep a Microsoft loop that kind of keeps everything in place so they can get an idea in real time of where we're at when it comes to all of those things. And then using, dashboards and reports within ServiceNow as well to show where we're at from a replatforming perspective. On top of that, right, we've had some initial, and it's just because replatforming has been so busy, we haven't had a chance yet, but we've had some initial conversations, I think, really planting the seed of, okay, the next step before we go live with our replatforming is working with each of the executive steering committee folks and whoever they deem folks that represent those areas as well, to start building our roadmap, right? Some of the things I mentioned before, OT, clean energy, the things that we have here for us, how do we start putting those into the roadmap in 2025? Some of the stuff around application portfolio management, just the different things that I know I've heard and we've had kind of conversations with when I've spoken with folks that we want to do within ServiceNow, that we want to do within AES, putting those into a roadmap so we understand, where do we have capacity? where do we start forecasting budget to allow us to do those things? And again, really putting that roadmap together. And we're actually working with you all on two things, right? Putting together a proper governance model, and really having that in a digestible, easy to find location, within the knowledge base, within some of the areas that we have within IRM as well for process, documentation, but having a centralized location for the processes for everything else within ServiceNow. And again, working with you all, I think, and the rest of AES to figure out what does that roadmap look like? What is our appetite for the things that we want to do within ServiceNow? And then lastly, right, how do we put that ideation and that demand inside of ServiceNow? That's another challenge that we have that we want to address in the very near future is when we have teams, HR I talked about earlier, they've spoken with us and said, I've got email that comes in, I've got Teams messages, I've got all these things where people say, hey, HR, we want you to do this neat thing, within the landscape of AES. And they have to track all of that within multiple tools. We want to be able to use ServiceNow to have that demand management, have that ideation of everything coming into one place and make determinations on, does it make sense for us to proceed forward? Do we have the resources, the bandwidth, the finance to be able to do those things? And so using ServiceNow to do that going forward is really going to be key and instrumental, I think, in helping us manage all of that.
You mentioned roadmap a couple of times. So this is more of a fun question that, what are some things that you're keeping your eyes on for like future ServiceNow features? Anything catching your eye that you want to go towards? Or are you still so knee deep into the replatform you don't even want to think about it?
Well, I mean, one huge one, absolutely. And I think we'd be remiss. I think a lot of people are also jumping into this as well as the Gen AI capabilities. Using AI within ServiceNow, there's machine learning, there's a lot of capabilities through automation. And I think those are really the three big ones that we try to move towards, that we want to move towards, is that, Gen AI, the machine learning capabilities, the automation where possible. Because, right now, agents are going in and they're working tickets. And one big thing that we're going to be doing going forward as well is using the agent workspace, service operations workspace. But, with that comes those Gen AI capabilities, right? To help agents quickly kind of know exactly how to remediate a ticket that comes in based on, a lot of it comes down to having strong, good knowledge content, strong foundational data. And that's a big piece when we go back to replatforming. Why we're replatforming is we're building the foundation to allow us to use Gen AI and use that successfully and properly, right? If we have a bad knowledge base, if we have a bunch of bad foundational data within ServiceNow, Gen AI can only take us so far. And so we're getting that strong foundation in place. But to your point, that's a big piece of what we want to do going forward is move into those AI capabilities within ServiceNow to help us.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Chris, for your time. I know how busy you are, and everybody's busy, but you're especially busy with everything you've got going on with the global situation, replatforming, all that. So thank you so much. So for everybody watching, thanks again for tuning in, and please do us a favor, like, subscribe, and suggest anything that you want to see, and we'll see you on the next podcast. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sean.